Have you ever wondered how people survived the sweltering summer heat before the invention of air conditioning? Imagine being a medieval noble, trapped inside a stone castle in the middle of July, with no fans, no ice, and no electricity. Yet, somehow they kept their vast halls, bedrooms, and even banquets surprisingly cool. Today, we're uncovering the forgotten secrets of how medieval nobles cooled their homes, techniques so clever that many are still used in architecture today. Stick with me until the end, because some of these ancient methods might just inspire how you keep cool in your own home. And before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to Quiet Boring Sleep, where history's quiet details come alive. Chapter 1. The problem of heat in the medieval world. When you think of a medieval castle, what comes to mind? Cold, drafty stone walls in winter, perhaps, or vast banquet halls echoing with music and laughter. Yet, it may surprise you to know that during the summer months, life inside these massive fortresses could become oppressively hot. The image of a knight in shining armor is glamorous, but anyone who has worn chainmail in the sun would quickly realize how suffocating it could feel. And for nobles who lived in castles year-round, cooling their homes was not just about comfort, it was a matter of survival. Imagine standing inside the thick stone walls of a 13th century castle in July, the walls that kept out the winter cold, also trapped the summer heat. Fires burned constantly in kitchens to prepare food, while narrow windows, designed for defense rather than ventilation, let in little fresh air. Life inside could feel stifling. Without modern conveniences like electric fans or air conditioning, medieval nobles were forced to develop practical, though sometimes tedious, methods of cooling their living spaces to understand how they did. And we must first look at the structure of the castles themselves. Castles were built for defense above all else. Their walls were thick, sometimes several meters across, designed to withstand sieges and bombardments. But those same walls also acted as insulators. In winter, they helped to retain the heat from fires. In summer, they absorbed sunlight during the day and released it slowly at night, often keeping the rooms warmer than the air outside. A castle courtyard might feel open and breezy, but step inside a great hall with limited ventilation, and you would immediately notice the difference. For nobles, discomfort was more than an inconvenience. Their social status demanded that they host guests, entertain dignitaries, and conduct affairs of state in spaces that were expected to demonstrate wealth and refinement. No one wanted to attend a banquet where the air was thick with the smell of sweat, roasting meat, and stagnant smoke. Cooling methods were not just for health, they were essential for maintaining appearances. One of the first and most obvious methods of cooling was architectural design. Builders of castles and manors understood the natural flow of air, even if they did not describe it in modern scientific terms. Many castles included high ceilings and tall windows, especially in the great halls. Hot air rises, and the higher the ceiling, the more space there was for heat to move away from the people seated below. In some cases, slits or openings were cut near the tops of walls, allowing hot air to escape while cooler air filtered in from below. These early forms of ventilation may not have been efficient by modern standards, but they made a noticeable difference. Beyond architecture, nobles also turned to the natural environment for relief. Many castles were constructed near rivers, lakes, or the sea. The breeze off the water helped to cool the surrounding air, and sometimes it was deliberately channeled into the castle's lower levels. Underground chambers, often used as storage. Cellars were noticeably cooler, and in times of intense heat, nobles would sometimes retreat to these spaces to find relief. Gardens also played an important role in the cooling process. The medieval garden was not only a place of beauty, but also a carefully designed microclimate. High stone walls or hedges enclosed many gardens, providing shade and blocking harsh winds while trapping cooler, moister air. Fountains, pools, and small artificial streams were often incorporated, not simply for their aesthetic value, but because the presence of water helped to lower the surrounding temperature. On hot days, nobles would spend hours strolling in these shaded gardens, taking advantage of the natural cooling effects of water and greenery. Clothing, too, was a factor in staying cool. While portraits often show nobles in heavy brocade gowns and elaborate layered outfits, these were typically reserved for formal occasions. On hot summer days, many nobles opted for lighter linen garments. Linen, made from flax, was highly valued in the medieval world for its breathability and ability to wick moisture away from the skin. Servants, too, would wear linen shifts beneath heavier garments, allowing them to manage heat more effectively. But what about inside the castle itself, where the heat could be oppressive? Here, nobles relied on strategies that may seem surprisingly familiar to us today. One method was the use of curtains and tapestries, not only for decoration, but also as a way to control airflow and block heat. Thick wall hangings provided insulation, but in summer, lighter fabrics could be hung across windows to diffuse the sunlight while still allowing breezes to pass through. In wealthier households, finely woven textiles from the Middle East, such as silk or cotton, might be used for this purpose, bringing both luxury and practicality into the space. Another practice involved the strategic use of straw and rushes on floors. These materials were replaced regularly, and in summer months, they were sometimes dampened slightly to create a cooling effect as the moisture evaporated. While this was a subtle method, it made a difference in the overall feel of a room, especially in smaller chambers where the air might otherwise remain stagnant. Food and drink also played a role in the medieval approach to cooling. Cold beverages were rare, as ice was not widely available outside of winter months. But cool water drawn from wells or streams was refreshing compared to the heavy wines and ales typically consumed. In some cases, snow and ice were stored in deep pits insulated with straw, providing a limited supply of chilled refreshments even in the height of summer. This was a luxury available only to the wealthiest nobles, but it demonstrates the lengths to which people would go to achieve relief from the heat. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of medieval cooling methods is how social practices adapted to the seasons. Banquets and gatherings were often scheduled for the evening rather than the heat of midday. During the hottest parts of the day, nobles might withdraw to shaded chambers or outdoor pavilions. Even warfare was influenced by the season's campaigns, were more common in spring and autumn than in the height of summer, when the burden of armor and the risk of heat exhaustion made combat especially brutal. These methods may seem simple, even obvious, but they were essential in a world where overheating could lead to serious illness or even death. Heat stroke was not understood in modern medical terms, but its effects were well known. Chroniclers occasionally recorded the deaths of individuals who collapsed in the summer heat, often describing it as a kind of sudden fever. Avoiding such outcomes required constant vigilance and adaptation. When you picture nobles strolling through shaded gardens, sitting in cool stone chambers, or sipping water drawn from deep wells, you begin to realize how carefully medieval people observed and adapted to their environment. Far from being helpless against the summer heat, they developed a wide range of strategies, some architectural, some environmental, some social, that together created a system of survival and comfort. And yet, as effective as these methods could be, they were not always enough. There are accounts of summers so brutally hot that even the thick walls of castles provided little relief. In these times, one wonders, what more could nobles have done to protect themselves against the relentless heat? Chapter 2. Castles, courtyards, and cooling strategies in practice. If Section 1 gave us the broad picture of medieval cooling, then Section 2 allows us to step closer into the halls and courtyards of real castles. Here, we can see how nobles and their architects did more than simply endure summer. They reshaped their homes and their habits around the seasons. To begin, Consider the great castles of France and England, where summer heat could vary from mild warmth to oppressive waves. One striking example is Château de Coucy in northern France, built in the early 13th century. With its vast circular keep, nearly 35 meters across, it offered a stronghold of stone that was both awe-inspiring and functional. But its builders also understood airflow. Large upper windows, narrow at the base for defense, widened inward to draw breezes into the Great Hall. Visitors recorded how even in summer, the interior air felt different, heavier with smoke from the hearths. Yes, but often cooler than the outside courtyard. In England, Windsor Castle presented another solution. The medieval structure included a vast network of underground storage rooms and passages. These were used primarily for supplies, yet nobles sometimes retreated there during the hottest weeks of summer. The cool of the earth, what we might call a natural air conditioning effect, was an invaluable relief. Some of these underground spaces doubled as wine cellars, where barrels of drink remained at steady temperatures year-round. To sit in such a chamber on a sweltering July day must have been a welcome escape from the heavy heat above. But castles were not uniform in their designs. In the Mediterranean, the problem of summer heat was even more acute, and here, architectural solutions became more elaborate. Consider the palaces of Islamic Spain, particularly the Alhambra in Granada, built by the Nasrid dynasty in the 13th and 14th centuries. Its courtyards featured long pools of water, shaded arcades, and fountains that constantly circulated cool air. For nobles accustomed to life in the arid climate of southern Spain, water was more than luxury, it was necessity. The cool mist of fountains, the shade of carved wooden screens, and the deliberate planting of fragrant orange trees all contributed to a microclimate that softened the relentless sun. Though northern European castles never achieved such elaborate cooling systems, the influence of Mediterranean design slowly spread. Nobles who traveled on crusade often returned with ideas and inspirations. The idea of courtyards with fountains, gardens enclosed by high walls, and flowing water features became fashionable in France and England in the later Middle Ages. Even when not directly copied, the principle was the same: water and greenery could turn oppressive heat into tolerable comfort. Yet these architectural solutions required planning and wealth. Not every castle could afford fountains or elaborate gardens. Many relied on simpler methods. One common feature was the solar, or private chamber, often located on the upper floors of a keep. Solars were typically reserved for the lord and lady of the castle, and they were carefully positioned to maximize both light and airflow. Unlike the Great Hall, which needed to accommodate dozens or even hundreds, the solar was smaller, easier to ventilate, and often opened onto a private gallery or balcony where breezes could circulate more freely. Another overlooked detail is the placement of stairwells and passageways. Medieval builders often designed spiral staircases with narrow slits of windows, not only for defense but also to allow air movement. Hot air would rise through the stairwells, while cooler air could drift into chambers from shaded sides of the castle. These were small adjustments, but when combined, they made a difference in how tolerable the interior felt. The human side of these strategies is equally important. Consider the servants and retainers whose task it was to manage the comfort of their lords. Tapestries and hangings had to be rotated seasonally. Heavy woolen coverings for winter, lighter fabrics for summer. Straw rushes laid on floors were replaced more frequently in hot months to prevent rot and odor. In wealthier households, basins of water might be placed around rooms, their evaporation lending a slight cooling effect. Servants fanned nobles during banquets, not constantly, as one might imagine in ancient Rome, but enough to circulate the heavy air during feasts. Speaking of food, diet and dining customs shifted subtly with the seasons. In summer, lighter dishes were preferred where possible, though medieval cuisine never escaped its reliance on bread, meat, and ale. Cooling fruits, such as cherries, apples, and pears, were eagerly consumed when available. Cold dishes like pottages. Stews could be served at room temperature, offering some relief compared to hot roasts. On particularly hot days, banquets might be held outdoors, under tents or pavilions, where breezes were stronger. Of course, not all methods were successful. Medieval people did not fully understand the science of air circulation, and some solutions proved less effective than intended. Thick tapestries could trap heat as easily as they blocked it, and damp rushes sometimes created unpleasant odors in confined rooms. Still, what emerges from the record is an image of nobles constantly adjusting their environment. They may not have had thermometers, but they were keen observers of comfort. Another key point is the seasonal rhythm of life. In summer, the daily schedule of a noble household often shifted. The hottest hours, typically noon to mid-afternoon, were reserved for rest or indoor activities. Formal audiences might be delayed until evening, when halls cooled somewhat. Hunting, a favored pastime of the nobility, was often conducted in the morning hours when the air was still fresh. These rhythms were not arbitrary. They mirrored the survival strategies of peasants working the fields, adjusted for the setting of a castle. And then there were the extremes. Records occasionally described summers so hot that even these strategies failed. The summer of 1315, for example, marked the beginning of the Great Famine in Europe. A combination of heavy rains, crop failures, and climatic shifts led to years of hunger. In the midst of this, nobles and peasants alike suffered from unusual weather patterns, sweltering days followed by storms. Chroniclers note illnesses spreading during these summers, particularly fevers and exhaustion. For nobles, accustomed to some comfort, the limits of their cooling methods were starkly revealed. What makes these accounts particularly striking is how they show the deep connection between architecture, environment, and daily life. Castles were not just military strongholds or symbols of power. They were living spaces that had to adapt to seasonal demands. The art of cooling them was less about luxury and more about practicality, though nobles naturally turned necessity into a display of wealth wherever possible. A fountain was not merely a practical feature. It was a sign that its owner could command both labor and water in abundance. By the later Middle Ages, many castles were slowly transforming into palaces, less defensive and more focused on comfort. Here, the lessons of summer heat played a role. Larger windows, broader courtyards, and ornamental gardens all reflected a growing awareness that comfort was as important as security. Nobles could afford to think about cooling their homes more deliberately, and in doing so, they laid foundations for the architecture of the Renaissance. Yet even in these grand spaces, the problem of summer heat was never fully solved. The thick stone walls, the smoky halls, the heavy air, these were inescapable realities of medieval life. Nobles found ways to endure, but comfort remained fragile, dependent on weather, wealth, and careful planning. And it leaves us with an intriguing question. If medieval nobles went to such lengths to cool their castles, how much greater were the challenges faced by ordinary villagers who lacked both stone walls and servants to ease their discomfort? Chapter 3. From Castles to Palaces, the lasting legacy of medieval cooling. By the later Middle Ages, castles were undergoing a transformation. The towering keeps and fortified walls that once stood primarily as defensive strongholds began to give way to more open, comfortable residences. Warfare was changing. Gunpowder was rendering many fortifications less effective, and with that shift came a new architectural focus: how to live not only securely, but comfortably. Cooling, once a matter of improvisation, became more intentional. One of the clearest examples of this shift can be seen in the palaces of late medieval and early Renaissance Europe. Take the Palace of the Popes in Avignon, constructed in the 14th century. Though still formidable in its outward appearance, the palace was filled with wide halls, lofty windows, and airy chapels. Builders paid careful attention to airflow, positioning openings to capture breezes from the Rhine River. Here, cooling was not just practical, it became part of the display of wealth and refinement. To step into such a palace on a hot summer's day was to experience the authority of the church, not just in stone, but in the comfort it could provide. The trend continued with royal residences. In France, the shift from castles to chateaux reflected more than just a change in military technology. The Château de Blois and Château de Chambord, for example, contained vast open staircases, interior courtyards, and terraces designed as much for light and air as for defense. Gardens became extensions of living space, with shaded walks, fountains, and groves carefully cultivated to offer relief from summer heat. Though these belong partly to the Renaissance, their roots lie in the medieval experiments with courtyards, water features, and ventilation. If we follow this thread further, it becomes clear that the medieval strategies were not simply discarded. They were refined, adapted, and incorporated into the language of architecture. Cross-ventilation, for instance, a concept that we still discuss in modern building design, was already being practiced when medieval builders aligned windows to catch prevailing winds. Thermal mass, the idea that thick walls regulate interior temperatures, remains a principle in sustainable architecture today. Medieval builders may not have had modern thermometers, but they observed and harnessed these effects with a practicality that endures. Yet it wasn't just architecture that left a legacy. Habits and rhythms of daily life also carried forward. The custom of adjusting one's activities to the sun and the seasons persisted long after the Middle Ages. In Mediterranean regions, the siesta tradition, rooted in the simple fact of afternoon heat, has parallels in medieval noble households where afternoons were reserved for quiet indoor pursuits. Even the idea of using gardens as cool retreats, filled with shade and flowing water, remains popular in modern urban design. One striking detail is how knowledge moved between cultures. Crusaders returning from the Holy Land brought with them not just stories of war, but observations of architecture and domestic comfort. The shaded courtyards and fountains of Islamic palaces inspired European nobles to adopt similar features. This cultural exchange, born of conflict, yet resulting in shared ideas of comfort, reminds us that history often advances in indirect ways. By the 5th, 10th, and 16th centuries, the image of a noble retreating to a cool garden pavilion or strolling through a shaded gallery had become almost expected. It was a mark of refinement, of mastery not only over land and people, but over the environment itself. Nobles who once struggled to endure the stifling heat of their stone halls now prided themselves on offering guests a measure of relief from the summer sun. Cooling had become a symbol of status, but what about the long-term influence on ordinary architecture? After all, most of us today do not live in castles or palaces. The answer lies in the way medieval principles filtered down over centuries. Rural cottages and townhouses, though simpler, employed many of the same strategies: thick stone or timber walls, small shaded windows, and seasonal adjustments in daily rhythm. As cities grew, builders increasingly considered airflow, shading, and the placement of courtyards. Even the placement of streets in medieval towns, narrow and winding, helped shield inhabitants from the full glare of the sun. Fast forward to today, and you can still see echoes of these medieval solutions in our homes. Modern passive cooling techniques, green roofs, shaded courtyards, natural ventilation mirror ideas first tested in castles and palaces. Architects now speak of designing with the climate rather than against it, a principle medieval builders understood instinctively. Even our fascination with stone houses or rustic retreats connects, in part, to the way those thick medieval walls offered both warmth in winter and relief in summer. There's a quiet irony in this legacy. For all their wealth, medieval nobles could never fully escape the discomfort of heat. At best, they mitigated it. Their castles might be cooler than the fields outside, but they were still far from the luxury of modern air conditioning. And yet, In their experiments, whether hanging damp cloths across open windows, building fountains in courtyards, or aligning chambers to catch breezes, they laid the groundwork for principles we continue to refine. Perhaps this is the true lesson of medieval cooling. It was less about defeating heat than about learning to live with it. Nobles adjusted their architecture, their meals, their clothing, and even their schedules around the rhythm of the seasons. They adapted sometimes clumsily, sometimes with ingenuity. In that sense, their experience is not so distant from our own. We too face the question of how to design for comfort in a warming world, how to live not against nature, but within it. And it leaves us with a final reflection. If the strategies of medieval nobles' stone walls, shaded gardens, flowing water are still relevant today, might we also learn from their acceptance of discomfort? In an age of rising temperatures and energy crises, perhaps the past reminds us that cooling need not always mean conquering heat, but sometimes learning how to endure. And that brings us to the end of today's quiet journey through history. I hope you found comfort in the small, forgotten details of the past, and maybe even drifted a little closer to sleep along the way. If you enjoyed spending this time with me, I'd be so grateful if you gave this video a like. It really helps more people discover these calming stories. And if you'd like to join me again for more quiet, boring history told for sleep, don't forget to subscribe to Quiet, Boring Sleep. Until next time, may your night be peaceful and your dreams gentle. Good night.